We must recreate the European family in a regional structure, called it may be the United States of Europe. And the first practical step would be to form a Council of Europe. If at first all the states of Europe are not willing or able to join the Union, we must nevertheless proceed to assemble and combine those who will and those who can.
During the decade following World War II, two major geopolitical transformations began to alter European alliance networks forever. The European integration called for by Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Cold War. This bipolar mentality permeated all major geopolitical considerations after 1945 and deeply influenced the course of European cooperation. However, the EU and its predecessors also impacted the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States.
In 1950, French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman publicly called for a more formalized system of European integration. In his Schuman Declaration, the French minister suggested the establishment of an intergovernmental authority to oversee coal and steel industries in Western Europe. This international organization would promote economic interdependence and decrease the likelihood of war between former rivals France and Germany, and in Europe more broadly. This proposal grew into the European coal and steel community, including France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg.
At the same time, the socialist nations, including the USSR, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania, also sought to unite. Between 1949 and 1950, these nations joined the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or COMECON. The leaders of this organization sought to formalize financial cooperation between the nations of Eastern Europe and provide an alternative to the US-led Marshall Plan.
The leaders who signed the 1951 Treaty of Paris to found the ECSC had these developments in Eastern Europe in mind. In a 1952 speech, an Italian foreign minister pushed Europe to join together while historically refuting communism. Political commentators from news outlets across the member nations depicted the USSR as an all-conquering force in political cartoons as well. They presented integration as the only possible defense against Soviet encroachment. These commentaries illustrate that although the leaders publicly spoke of widespread prosperity and the end to European wars, the desire to counter the Soviet bloc represented a major motive.
The subsequent Soviet response dismissed the idealistic rhetoric of peace, stability, and growth that surrounded the foundation of the ECSC. The Kremlin also rejected the defensive claims that the nations needed to integrate to protect themselves from increased socialist influence. Instead, Soviet government news agencies angrily denounced the Schuman Plan as part of the U.S. arrangement to seize hold of the countries of Western Europe for good and all. This rhetoric demonstrates that instead of promoting cooperation throughout all of Europe, the establishment of the ECSC reinforced the divide between the West and the Soviet sphere of influence. To Moscow, the Schuman Plan merely represented the successor to the Marshall Plan and the next phase of growing U.S. influence in Europe.
As the increasing scope of European integration became clear to the Kremlin, some Soviet leaders became open to either creating a modified version of the proposed European Defense Community or joining an altered version of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Following the foundation of NATO, in 1949, a group of Western European leaders proposed a similar organization that would include only nations on the continent, but retain American support. In response, the USSR proposed its own alternative that would exclude the US entirely. Although the prospective EDC leadership rejected this plan, Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, signaled that the USSR would be willing to join a modified NATO instead and cooperate with the West for collective European security. However, the US rejected the Kremlin's proposal in 1954, and Molotov ceased the USSR's attempt to join a Western security organization a year later. Although Molotov's proposals may have been insincere, these efforts represent a reversal of the original Soviet response to the ECSC in 1952.
Over the next few years, Western European leaders continued negotiations to increase economic integration. Following negotiations in 1956, the nations signed the Treaty of Rome the following year. The treaty founded the European Economic Community that enhanced financial cooperation between member states, eliminating many barriers to trade and worker migration. 2 years after indicating a desire to join a collective European defense organization, Soviet leaders once again criticized the integration of Western powers. In March 1957, the new Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, denounced the EEC. In a statement, Gromyko approved of the principle of pan-European cooperation, but accused the signatories of creating false fronts for NATO and U.S. aggression. This harsh criticism illustrated Soviet feelings toward integration in the West. Although the Kremlin understood the desire to collaborate, they feared that these groupings were merely pawns of U.S. leadership.
During the 1960s, the nations of the EEC continued to build on the Treaty of Rome by implementing a combined agricultural market, negotiating collective trade deals with developing nations, and fully eliminating trade tariffs among the 6 countries. Throughout the decades, Soviet leaders continued to issue statements critical of the EEC. Khrushchev condemned continued Western European integration as an instrument of imperialism and neocolonialism. Soviet political cartoons repeatedly lampooned the organization as fraught with infighting over the inclusion of the United Kingdom and generally counterproductive. During this time of heightened Cold War tensions, the USSR sought to portray the EEC as useless.
This debate over the UK highlighted EEC discussions. Following its initial decision not to attempt to join, the UK applied in both 1961 and 1969, partly due to the economic decline of the Commonwealth. French Prime Minister Charles de Gaulle vetoed British membership both times due to fears that the UK would merely be an American proxy and usurp France's powerful position in the EEC. Due to existing economic ties, Denmark, Ireland, and Norway refused to join without London. Although Norway later declined membership, the other 3 acceded in 1973.
2 years later, nations from both blocs met in Finland to discuss cooperation. The resulting Helsinki Accords committed the nations to economic, technical, and scientific cooperation along with human rights guarantees. The signatories also guaranteed to recognize the post-World War II boundaries of Europe, the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states, and the division of Germany. Sarah Snyder argues that the human rights groups formed after Helsinki increased pressure on the USSR and inspired perestroika.
During the 1980s, the EEC added Greece, Spain, and Portugal. This expansion incorporated less industrialized agricultural societies, causing regional inequalities. Bailouts! Although Franco's Spain and the Greek military junta had applied to enter the EEC in the 1960s, they were not accepted until the 1980s, when their respective regimes had since democratized. Hebel and Lentz argue that this period marked the transformation of the EEC into a Wertegemeinschaft, or value community, based on a liberal democratic political identity. This new self-definition put the EEC in direct opposition to the authoritarian USSR.
The political and economic successes of European integration even sparked a change in Soviet attitudes towards Europe, culminating in Gorbachev's desire for a common European home. While first used to isolate the U.S. from European NATO allies and soften American foreign policy, Gorbachev later called for negotiations between Comecon and the EEC. Subsequently, the USSR launched the European Charm Offensive in 1987 to further economic coordination. As a central tenet of perestroika, the common European home represents a link between the allure of the EEC and Gorbachev's glasnost policies that marked the beginning of the end for the USSR. The subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union represented a cataclysmic event that permanently altered the scope of European integration.
The 1992 Treaty on European Union transformed the EEC from an economic bloc into a proto-supranational organization. The agreement focused on collaboration in 3 main areas: social, economic, and governmental practices. This period also marked the rise of recently reunified Germany as the powerhouse of the EU.
The 1995 accession of Finland, Sweden, and Austria began the EU's final wave of European expansion. These former neutral nations situated in the East-West buffer zone moved the EU east. In the next 2 decades, many former Soviet satellites and Soviet socialist republics joined the organization.
Yet, the EU's recent spread into Eastern Europe is not without its costs. Problems stemming from the organization's size and the diverse economic interests it represents have caused conflicts within the group. The addition of the Baltics and many former Soviet bloc states has alarmed Moscow. In response, the Russian Federation has tried to cultivate and expand economic relations with the former SSRs of Central Asia.
Today, the fractious East-West division of the Cold War has taken on a new form, although its locus has moved farther east. While the fight over economic systems is over, the geopolitical battles of the Cold War have moved to the Ukraine. These tensions have frightened EU members, including Poland and Estonia. These recent developments have raised the question: has European integration fostered regional stability or exacerbated great power rivalries?